And we're live. Welcome to the Rican show. And today I want to welcome back Michael Johns. A little bit about Michael Johns. I there's so much to say about Michael Johns. That's why I just put co-founder of the Tea Party movement because uh, he helped co-found that movement where people don't. The Tea Party was very misunderstood at its time, and I think it still is. But Michael himself, this is a man with lots of years of experience. He worked with the Reagan administration. He also worked with Bush Senior. He helped. Basically, he's a foreign policy expert, in particular with national security, and graduated from Harvard. I mean, Harvard, you mean from University of Miami, and he also went to. He studied overseas in the University of Cambridge, which is very prestigious. And he also did work with the Heritage Foundation, which there's some contemporaries there that everybody knows that like Dinesh D'Souza and Tucker Carlson. He helped lead the Reagan doctrine, which I'll let him explain that because, I was just a little single digits when Reagan was president, so I don't remember as much. My experience is more remembering the Clinton years than the Reagan and the Bush years. So, and he also worked on the 9/11 Commission with Thomas Kean, and he's also worked in with Fortune 500, 1,000 companies, and with healthcare. So, with that being said, Michael, thank you for coming on again.
Carlos, great to be back with you. Thanks for what you've been doing.
It's been a while. I mean, a lot's happened, and since the last time I've had you on, I've changed up my show a little bit. Before I used to record it, now I just live stream it. And 2 years of Biden, and
yeah,
I mean, where are you?
Fire, and the country is on fire.
And it's funny.
I think we can say this is. I'm not saying this like for hyperbole or to. I don't think you need to inflame any of the realities. They're all underlying facts. This country has never been in a more dangerous, terrifying, frightening moment. And the more you understand about it, the closer you are both to the macroeconomic climate, to the financial markets, to the geopolitical situation, to our national security deficiencies and threats, to the obvious border crisis, the more you realize we have a leadership and a president who is not simply misguided on policy, because we've confronted that many times. You mentioned Clinton. Clinton and conservatives saw eye to eye on a very few things. They did see eye to eye on a few things, but I don't think anyone during the Clinton administration felt that this was a man literally trying to tear down the country. I think it's very difficult right now to look at this Biden administration and come to any other conclusion that for whatever the ulterior motive, whether he's compromised, as many believe, in some capacity, meaning he's not making decisions in sovereign interests and according to his constitutional responsibilities, or whether there are other forces simply, at play, issues related to his actual legitimacy from the 2020 election, potentially. We need to get to the bottom of those, as the phrase goes. It's long overdue, and we need to stop them, obviously, and turn these things around and hold people accountable.
Well, that's what I like. What Trump said at CPAC, where he said about we have to have the same ground game that the Democrats have. We need to, if in these states you're going to have ballot harvesting, if you're going to have the drop boxes, then you need to beat them at their own game, because if that's what they're doing and if it's legal, then we might as well take advantage of it too.
Well, and it's absurd given the magnitude of resources that went into the Republican National Committee, knowing the COVID circumstances that had driven many of those decisions in 2020, that there wasn't a conscious effort to undergo it. And it's further absurd that we've just given Ronna McDaniel another term running the RNC after what has been, I think, really just uniformly disastrous performance, with the exception of fundraising. They always seem to they perform well on that, whatever you may say. Same with Republican leadership. They raise, that's essentially what the power base is their ability to raise money.
But money doesn't mean nothing if you had a horrible 2 years of Biden, and then you lose the Senate, and you barely win the House. It should have been a landslide.
In a moment when we've been going through this absurd debate over the utilization of pronouns, which is ridiculous, right? I mean, people are men or they're women, or even if they self-identify alternatively, you know what the pronoun is. We shouldn't be having every single person to define what it is. I don't think I've ever seen anything so utterly politically generated and motivated, but everything that's going on has been by design. The important message, and I think that's a different message than maybe other of my fellow conservatives are communicating right now, is the time for blaming the other side for all of these mammoth victories that they've had, basically claiming ownership now over essentially every major institution in American civil society, all these institutions that are at the foundation of our constitutional republic, and without which, really society begins to break down, have been compromised, infiltrated, their agendas in many cases just blatantly and openly transformed. I never would have thought, having a degree in business management, that we would reach a moment where essentially every New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ publicly traded company in this country would move away from maximizing return on investment for their investor base as a core goal, and instead embrace not anything really
ESG
coherent, but this ESG agenda, which is all basically just turn your money over to us and we'll make sure that we do something positive with it. It's extortion, essentially. But this is my message. Stop blaming the globalist and the left for their successes, because they are succeeding because when they started drilling against some of these core institutions in ways that were almost transparently and obviously offending to the vast majority of Americans. Meaning, so for instance, when they went after a company, they didn't go after just some obscure company. They went after like Disney, something that's sort of at the heart of Americana, right? Designed to create questions and trepidation really about the future of things that we've come to rely on as pure and holistic and necessary and associated with American ingenuity and American success. They realized there was no one on our side, no one who was really prepared to shed blood or take any steps necessary to defend these institutions, and that for all of the resources that are poured into right of center organizations, and predominantly inside the swamp in DC, these organizations themselves, once the rubber really hit the road, didn't really even understand the game and didn't have the wherewithal or the boldness, frankly, the guts, which are kind of at the core characteristics of being able to engage and defend our interests. And as a result, they kept drilling, expecting that they would hit metal at some point. It was all jello. It was all rhetoric and talk, and a movement comprised of lots of talk and very little in the way of the operational functionality that's necessary to be able to win in these. And as they did that, they also broke down, which is we shouldn't ever forget this, any immediate prospects of bipartisanship and cross-ideological cooperation, which I've always believed in theoretically, not at any expense, not at the expense of detrimental policies for the country, but that the functional reality was that it was always a system that was set up kind of as an adversarial system, like a court system is, that you would have these two different sides that would collide, and the truth would ultimately emerge that was better and at the end of the day more representative of the body politic than any one side individually would be able to put forward. But we've gotten to a point now where no one's listening, and even the very idea of an undecided voter, at least in a general election sense, is, I don't, there's probably like a handful of them out there, but there's not many, and they're generally people that are not very engaged. So if somebody's saying, hey, hypothetically, Biden versus Trump in 2024, what side are you on? And they're like, I don't know. I'm going to give that some thought. That is not a prevailing mindset. Everyone, whatever concerns they may have about Biden, if they were with Biden in 2020, they're still with him. And, whatever concerns they may have about Trump, if they were with Trump in 2020, they're still with him.
No, I agree with that. I was going to say, one of my viewers asked a question. He put, which, seeing what you just said, I think I know what your answer is, but he put, are we more impacted by the war in Ukraine or the war on conservative culture in the U.S.?
I don't think it's, I will tell you this, I think it's all part of one package, because my position on the Ukraine conflict is that it was entirely avoidable. And if you go back to that NATO meeting, which I believe is in the beginning of the Obama administration, I think it was in Bucharest in Romania, where the recommendation came out from NATO, hey, let's put Ukraine and Georgia, right, two bordering countries, two countries within the former Soviet Union, two of the most powerful countries outside of Russia within the former Soviet Union, into NATO. It was unbelievably provocative. It would be the equivalent of Putin forging a national security and defense alliance with Mexico and
Canada.
And Canada. We would obviously we wouldn't just sit around dispassionately about that. The other thing is that, you go back, and I'll spare you kind of the histrionics of the how far back the conflict over the Donbass goes. But this has really been ultimately, it comes out of Crimea, out of the Donbass, and this, region of Eastern Ukraine that is largely Russian speaking, that has conflicting sentiments, there about where they live. Many residents there that are relatives in Russia. They're not particularly fond of the Ukrainian government. They don't speak the Ukrainian language, and they don't feel an affinity with Ukrainian culture. And but this I really believe, like, the NATO rhetoric, and then frankly Biden's mismanagement, right? Because so Trump handled it exactly correctly. He made it clear to Putin, there's no room for any expansionism on your part, and here are the ramifications if you do it. We were provocative throughout all of this, with continued rhetoric about possibly including them for NATO membership, and then getting into, once Putin put, I think, initially 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border, that ultimately went up to like 170, 180,000 before the February 22. We sent over these high-level delegations that made sort of unreasonable demands, and then once this conflict started, we imposed on Putin sanctions that were more serious than anything we ever put on the former Soviet Union, anything we ever put on Hitler and Nazi Germany. We sought to collapse the entire, the ruble as a global currency and the Russian economy. Now, the problem with this is, you go back, and for some Americans, maybe some conservatives even listening on, they're like, okay, so what? Here's the so what. One of the things that I took away from the mismanagement of the Carter administration, Jimmy Carter in hospice now, we pray for him. He's not,
I didn't hear about that.
Not long going to be with us, but and is a fine man, but his foreign policy was really disastrous. And here's how. He put human rights at the forefront of American foreign policy in a way that did not enhance human rights, and certainly was detrimental to U.S. security interests. So in Nicaragua, for instance, we imposed enormous sanctions on Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua that basically led to the Nicaraguan Revolution of 1979, the emergence of the Sandinista regime, which in turn led to the presence of Soviet and Cuban presence in our own hemisphere. And the human rights, in turn, which were very imperfect and worthy of condemnation under Somoza, got worse by a major multiplier effect. He did, and this is relevant today with the magnitude of protests we're seeing in Iran, the same thing in 1979 in Iran, where he took the Shah, who was, despite, again, many flaws, including human rights concerns, an extraordinary American ally in a very vital region of the world, and said, no, these human rights instances and examples that you are unacceptable, and we cut support off from the Shah. Well, did the human rights improve as a result of that? No, they got enormously worse with the emergence of the mullahs and the Ayatollah, and now what is the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world in the Iranian regime, on the verge of nuclear weapons development, and certainly among the world's worst oppressors of human rights. The genocidal regime of China is probably got the gold medal in that category. But my point being that the undermining of Putin with what were probably sanctions that one might argue were disproportionate and were not designed to bring about a resolution of the crisis, but were in themselves provocative because they threatened the very economy, led him into a whole series of additional steps, including now close formalized relationships with Xi Jinping in China.
I was gonna talk about that, because what I want people to realize is, because the left have become like the party of pro-war. I'm astonished by the turnaround
today. You remember Code Pink? I can remember. You mentioned the Heritage Foundation. Like, go back and look and say the Bush 43 years. Have a sort of panel discussion, say on Iraq and what to do next in the middle of that war. And they would just like rush in and disrupt these events and make a scene, and it was all because I thought, maybe not thoughtfully, but they had legitimate concern about the loss of our young people in Iraq. And by the way, I share that concern. We have an entire lot in Arlington Cemetery dedicated to some very brave 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old kids who died as a result of that purported cause, which and I would define anyone to, even at this point, define what that cause was. We've Iran more influential in Iraq than we were before. But my point is, this is with Russia. Okay, so meaning you never in geopolitics, and this should be a starting point. And somebody like Blinken, Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, who goes way back on this thing and is straight out of central casting as far as foreign policy credentials go. Harvard. I didn't go there. He did actually.
Sorry about that slip up.
Primary school in France, and National Security Council staff under Obama, and a bunch of establishment foreign policy credentials, should know very well that this is the government of the world that has the singular largest nuclear arsenal, larger than our own. And while its economy is probably about the size of Italy's, and they are not the threat because we prevailed in the Cold War, in large part because of the Reagan doctrine, which I'll be happy to explain. You can't just recklessly undermine a government there unless you have a very defined idea of what would come next. Now, somebody wants to ask me, well, where's an example where we did this correctly? And I think one example would be Reagan, the way Reagan handled the Philippines with Marcos, if you can remember, who was enormously corrupt. And Reagan wanted Marcos gone, but he didn't just go out and sort of undermine the regime, meaning at least, in somewhere between checkers and chess, there was at least a thought about what the second move was. And ultimately the Philippines went through, free and fair elections, and one could argue became more of a free nation after Marcos' departure. So he secured the same objective, but he thought carefully about what comes next. Between Ukraine and Russia, there are no good guys involved here. I mean, and I don't like at all the way we have had the Ukrainian government presented before the American people, who quite understandably are haven't heard a lot about this. They don't know the history of the Donbass. They don't know the history of Ukraine and its population segments or its sentiments, or the fact that it is, among the most corrupt kleptocracies in the world.
Well,
meaning
what I was going to say, Michael, was why I was comparing what happened like in the during the Iraq War and the protest, and how the left was like, we're anti-war. Where's that? Now if you tell someone on the left and you go, look at it through, like you said earlier, and I was going to make this point too, was if Russia and China tried to make an alliance, a security economic alliance with Mexico and Canada, we'd flip out, and rightfully so.
Well, and you could look at the way Kennedy handled the missile crisis in Cuba, and you can look at the way Reagan handled the presence of Cuban and Soviet troops in the meaning. I ended up very early in my life out with the Nicaraguan Contras twice. Enrique Bermudez, the military commander, who I got to know quite well, again, an imperfect guy. He was part of Somoza's National Guard, but he ran the Contras and was a key figure in our Cold War calculations on Central America in keeping the Soviets out of this hemisphere, and all of their associated national security ramifications of that, their listening posts, their bases, and on and on. Ultimately, he was shot dead in Managua. Jonas Savimbi in Angola, who I visited in southern Angola, middle of the bush, in the middle of nowhere. Again, hugely imperfect. Killed.
I got a question. Let me ask you this: do you think the way Biden left Ukraine, do you think that also had a play in Putin going, okay, I'm going to, let's take this region, because the way we screwed up that the withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, I believe the Afghanistan example showed how little sovereign sensibility Biden was bringing. Meaning, to this day, we've really heard no sensible explanation. Let's just walk through what happened in August of 21. You had Kabul. Firstly, you had a major strategic air base in Bagram Air Base, one of the most strategic air bases in the world, within a few hundred miles both of China and Iran. Might be convenient for the U.S. to hold on to something like that, right? On that base, very rarely mentioned, was one of the highest security prisons, the highest security prison in Afghanistan, holding some of the most dangerous terrorist elements who had been arrested and detained during our substantial presence there, including members of Al-Qaeda, including members of the more extended terrorist network that was existing under the Taliban before our intervention, which, unlike Iraq, was entirely warranted, entirely appropriate, and ultimately productive, and destroyed by Biden. But this base was, and our and the prison facility were just left completely unguarded. And literally, the Afghans on Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan woke up the next day and said, where are the Americans at? The electricity was turned out, the circuit breakers were turned out on the whole facility. Sure enough, the Taliban ultimately sprung loose. The terrorists, I think over 1,000.
Look at the billions of dollars of equipment we left behind. Like that should have been the first thing that we left.
You don't, by the way. So this was when I awakened immediately to the reality that this was not simply a policy dispute, but you look at it from sensibility standpoint and say, this is the product of someone being told to get out of Afghanistan and to do it quickly and recklessly, because this administration and its DOD and State Department personnel, we may differ with their policy view on the world, but they are competent people. They're educated people. I believe most of them love and respect the country. Would not have done it this way. And I said that because we've seen them hand off military assets historically in Iraq, same people, and they know the methodology that's involved in the planning that goes into it. You don't simply just get up and leave. And then sure enough, Bagram Air Base falls, and this has all been about China's engagement there. And Afghanistan working its way in ultimately as yet another CCP, China's Communist Party, client state, where Xi Jinping is putting together a network of countries that is very perilously close to dominating the Eurasian landmass, in my view. So,
well, it's funny that you mentioned. It's funny.
After we had reversed this trend under the Trump administration, right? Mm-hmm. So great accomplishments of President Trump. Obviously, let me give you two bilateral relationships that I think were enormously important and remain enormously important: Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. In Saudi Arabia, I believe that was Trump's first formal state visit abroad. He was very well received, and we made great progress with the bilateral relationship there. UAE, to some degree, even more so. I mean, they ended up recognizing, as you know, Israel, set off a series of steps of other countries that had not recognized Israel's right to exist.
The Abraham Accords.
The Abraham Accords, to set up formalized relationships. Both the Riyadh and UAE, I mean, both these governments now have looked at the discombobulation and unreliability, let me just put it that way, of the Biden administration.
That's a nice way of saying
it. And have convinced themselves that in superpower relationships that they ought to figure out what's going on with China. And so you've had a very dangerous level of improvement of relations there. That's going to be, by the way, a big mistake for Saudi Arabia and a big mistake for UAE. They're going to come to regret this like no decision that they've ever made. But you can't say that we were not part of the problem here in the sense, and I'll spare you all the details, but a lot of it, even with Yemen, the Houthi rebel movement there that Trump correctly had labeled a terrorist element. It's a complete Iran terrorist surrogate, and has created one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world and an undeniable threat to Saudi Arabia, lobbing missiles into Saudi Arabia, into the petroleum fields of Saudi Arabia as well. It would, having impact on global energy pricing, has been a real message to them. And the Iran policy as well. Iran is a major national security threat in that region, and including and especially maybe to Saudi Arabia and UAE. You see them stumbling over themselves to get back in this flawed Iran agreement, while Iran's moving forward with nuclear weapons development, whether we're in that agreement or out of that agreement. So my view is, don't reward them financially, because we'll get their weapons developed more quickly, not less quickly. And in the meantime, you're going to give them resources they're only going to use for the purposes of support for terrorism and domestic suppression. And their human rights conditions are just absolutely an abomination that really deserve major levels of attention, more than we are bringing to them, frankly.
So with all this that's going on around the world with this Biden administration, do you think it's just flawed policy, or do you think it's like what you talked about earlier, where you said that he's compromised? Do you think which do you think is more likely that's driving
it's the ultimate question? And now there's a thesis, and I've been involved in this for so long. If I go back, I'm not trying to be a name dropper here, but I happen to get to know Richard Nixon a little bit before his passing, late in his life, and Kissinger, whose work that I have, followed and read, and a guy named Winston Lord, who was part of the Nixon delegation with Mao, maybe the leading person behind it, really, one of our first diplomats in Beijing. I think ultimately, at least in Kissinger and Winston Lord, I think you have two guys who kicked off a thesis ultimately embraced by many Scientologists and many government officials of both parties of what's called managed decline. And it's one that Trump understands well and rejects. It's one that I understand well and reject. But the thesis basically runs like this: that the United States is a declining power, fact. Irreversible, undeniable, it's going to happen. We've lost our manufacturing base. We're unable to compete in the world. We have lost the faith-based and social cohesion that was kind of the formation and foundation of our country's original greatness. We have lost a sense of self-identity in the world, and we have made a series of debacles in the management of policy at high levels that have eroded confidence in our government at home and abroad. Let me just summarize it that way. Therefore, and China's ascent, which I completely disagree with, is unavoidable. It's inevitable. That's their view. And this creates a set of circumstances that any student of history would recognize as one of enormous concern, because your major conflicts and world wars have stemmed from moments when you have a declining superpower and an ascending superpower. So their justification for many of these steps, which they'll never explain, but I will, is one of implementing this managed decline, which is that we share the same end game. That's why they describe it as a competition, whereas I describe it as, correctly, as a genocidal enemy regime of the United States. I've also been one of a handful of people that has led, as you might have noted, a complete change in how we describe that government. We don't call it China any longer. We call it the CCP. And I was very forceful in that, because we have no enemies in China. China is a great country of 1.4 billion people who want to be liberated. And it's like the former Soviet Union, and also an enormously ethnically complex country that doesn't have a whole lot of loyalty to Beijing. I mean, your typical Tibetan, your typical Falun Gong, the typical underground Christian, typical Hong Kong, typical Uyghur in what they call East Turkestan. They don't want any part. They don't even want to be a part of China. And so you can see this conflict playing out rhetorically right now in a little bit of a verbal back and forth, but that's inherent. I think when you hear this administration, the Biden administration, describe them as competitors of ours, when Trump just got done defining Uyghur genocide, labeling them a genocidal regime, and the Biden administration has upheld it. People engaged in genocide, and this never again philosophy and theory that we all bought into, never again is happening right now. Those who put a lot of focus on it need to awaken, or it's going to lose all credibility. And I'm going to hammer that message home here very soon. But we need to recognize that whether it's the worst possible of all cases, meaning it's literally is the Mandarin candidate, or what is it,
Oh, that's a
the Manchurian candidate. Remember the movie from like
yeah. I was gonna say, and then you were describing what is it called?
20th century? I think it's like the 70s or 60s or 70s.
Well, they remade it. I know they had a remake with Denzel Washington. I never saw it, but
That would
I
be
know.
the worst. That would be the worst case scenario, obviously. And I'm
I
not.
was gonna say you were
I-
talking
I-
about when you said that whole the declining, and that's called the Thucydides trap or something like that. Isn't that what
Yeah.
that's called?
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't want to go into that. But look, for those.
Well, but I just remember that hearing that term before when you
Yeah.
just explained it. I was like, I know I've heard that before, and I just wanted
Well, look, this is the danger in dealing with tyrannical regimes is they put you consciously in a position of compromise. And it's also why they see someone like Hunter Biden, who's got a familial relationship with a powerful political family, and they knew was dealing with undeniable drug addiction issues and mental health issues, which are almost go always hand in hand. It was sucked into all of these financial engagements with the CCP, and particularly with the banking interests of China, who funded his private equity fund. He was, as I think everyone hopefully knows by now, put on the board of Burisma, the energy company in Ukraine, when he knew nothing about energy and nothing about Ukraine.
And he also did the energy deal with the Chinese company too.
The whole family, has been engaged for a long, long time, all the way back to when Biden championed this idea of making Delaware the home to banking interests, because
with the credit cards and all that.
Because he made it very difficult to sue banks in the state of Delaware over the traditional litigation you would see associated with financial institutions, which made it a magnet. So he traded off a lot of these political favors in exchange for regulatory favors that he granted big business. And this is the irony of it all, that he's granted big business and all of these entities that the left have long said they're skeptical of and have concerns with. They have now, as is the case with Code Pink and Issues of War and Peace, apparently no problems when it happens on their own side. So here that brings me just on Ukraine. So before before Putin moves on Ukraine, during the Winter Olympics in Beijing, this can't be forgotten. Putin goes down to Beijing, and that is to say, in my view, he's summoned to Beijing by Xi Jinping, and they sign what was called a Limitless Agreement. You can read this thing because Russia released it. It's online, and these are the relationships that the CCP likes to enter into with countries. They typically like to enter into agreements when these countries are desperate and in positions of desperate need. And then they like to make the nature of the relationships limitless. So you're going to see Xi Jinping and China extracting a lot more natural resources out of Russia. You're going to see, and that's going to be intriguing, I guess, to some extent, because Putin, I just can't imagine, is going to look too favorably upon the abuse that's coming his way, because that's what China does. Is the government of China, they abuse their partners, these so-called partners, because they don't view them as partners. They view them
it's kind of like what they did.
They call them, it's a Mandarin Chinese word for tributary states.
Yeah, I was saying, they
don't view any equals.
With the West, they do that with our intellectual properties, where we have to file our intellectual properties in China, and then they steal them.
Well, you can't. Yeah, for starters, you can't do. That's right. You cannot do any business in China without first releasing all of the mechanisms the intellectual property foundations of all products that are being made there. So and then of course,
well, I was going to say
is
in all countries you have to file like patents and trademarks. The only difference is, if you file it in Great Britain, you're pretty much safe, as opposed to filing it in China where you're not. Pretty much they're just gonna, they're just gonna steal the intellectual property and make it in their own country.
Well, and you can say, as I think some in this administration would say, that, well, we have these global institutions that are designed to mitigate these differences. But this has been another area that China has just been overwhelmingly successful, is that they have used their financial resources that frankly have come from their exploitive trade relationship with us. Yes. Trump is so right about that. We built this. If you go back to about 1980, like when Reagan won in 80, we didn't have a trade deficit with China. This has blossomed into the largest trade deficit in the history of the world economy. And it's done so in rapid order since Obama, right? I mean, we just, we're not defending core industries in this country, and we're allowing them to exploit it. They also, I think, I can't overlook this fact, have infiltrated the United States of America to an enormous degree.
No, I
there are very few institutions, including the government of the United States.
Yeah, no, they, I mean, even that, if I'm not mistaken, they have like a police force in New York City that polices like their expatriates.
Right.
And also,
the best example is, the Houston neighborhood where the consulate was based in Houston, Texas, is when Trump correctly found out that a lot of this internal sort of infiltration, monitoring, development of agents of influence, et cetera, was being done out of there, he correctly decided to shut that consulate down, and did so also correctly, very abruptly. And the consulate staff were in the back parking lot, literally like setting on fire all of these documents.
Yeah.
You had neighbors, I guess, seemingly unaware that was a location of the Chinese consulate, calling 911 that there was a fire in the neighborhood. No, it's just them burning all the magnitude of malevolent, dangerous, and almost certainly illegal activities.
Of course, I mean, in the universities, they're paying off professors. I mean, people have gotten charged with.
Yeah, look, and that's NIH funding.
Oh, that's, yeah.
When we look in the ongoing budget debate and the considerations and questions related to the budget, if you want to start, firstly, Medicare and Social Security should be off the table. Okay, I'm not saying that there aren't. I mean, if there are abuses in those systems, obviously those have got to be investigated and pursued. There should, if there's any way to do things more efficiently, that should be. But beneficiaries who've paid into these systems their whole working lives should not be denied it. And I frankly feel the same way about the safety net in the country. Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, if you read it, addresses the one of the benefits of capitalism is that it affords a safety net for people that non-free market economies and non-free nations do not. So, for instance, if you are in China right now and you're not afforded any of these protections, there's not a lot of immediate concern about this regime, which is the most murderous regime in the history of man, right? I mean, conservatively, 70, 80 million people, more likely 100 million.
I mean, Mao did 50 or 60 by himself.
Right. And now a genocide against the Uyghur people of 3 to 4 million Uyghurs who are being held in concentration camps, whose organs are being extracted, killing them for profit so that they can sell kidneys and hearts. We heard about this, by the way, for a while, about how people would show up in Shanghai who were in urgent needs of vital organ transplantation for livers, kidneys, hearts, lungs, and we're able to get them in days. And as you know, and as I think as you mentioned, I have an extensive background in healthcare industry, and I found this curious at first. Like, how was this getting done? It's now clear to me how it was being done. They are taking innocent individuals associated with an ethnic group they seek to extinguish, which is the definition of genocide, and removing these organs and selling them. And that's not it. I mean, the magnitude of the Uyghur issue alone would be a basis, if that were the only thing wrong in U.S.-Sino relationship, would be a basis for us to disengage completely from the regime in a logical way, not in an abrupt way, but in a logical way. I mean, we if you certainly want, and I always caution people, don't compare anything to Hitler. Hitler was Hitler. There is no Hitler 2.0. Don't compare anything to Nazi Germany. Each of these have their own individual stories, and they just need to be kept alive and vibrant in the minds of the Americans. And when we do things to remind people of the Holocaust, we do it not just so there's not a second Holocaust, but so that there's not a second genocide. But we now have a second genocide. So the individuals who've been engaged in this process, and I've been one, really need to step forward now, because there have been precisely zero ramifications to this regime. And right now, tonight, 3 to 4 million Uyghurs being held in concentration camps, essentially for detained without cause, in many cases killed, tortured without cause. And this is the reality that I know you know well, and most of us who've been involved in human rights and foreign policy know well. And one of the reasons we're so forceful in resisting it domestically is that once you lose the rule of law, once you lose the balance of power, once you lose accountability of government by and for the people, there is no net as far as how far you will go. And regimes that ascend in those sort of environments are usually malicious, sadistic, and unforgiving toward everyone, including, by the way, their supporters, which is maybe one of the ultimate ironies. Those championing these ESG sentiments and the sellout of some of the greatest companies in the history of the world economy are going to be surprised how little support they ultimately get once they do all of it.
Well, that's what happens. Like, you look at like the French Revolution, who were the people who got the guillotine, or the people who supported the revolution. Those were the first ones to go.
And the Bolsheviks, you can go back and look and the divide, within it. There's a lot, we've said forever that, there's value in understanding history. Well, one of the reasons understanding a revolution, the history of revolutions, whether they've been constructive revolutions like the American Revolution, one of the great developments in the history of man, and that needs to be kept alive, or
there's
Bolshevik
a couple
Revolution of 1917, is to understand that they usually are almost always conducted by a small percentage of the whole body politic.
There's a couple of questions some of the viewers have. I just want to address their questions, because one of them was good. I just checked with George.
Reagan, REA.
He put Reagan. He asked if what would Reagan think of Biden's policies?
Reagan would think, as Trump thinks, as I think, as every thinking American thinks, that he is destroying this country and we need to reverse course right away. You can go back and look. We just got done with CPAC. Go back and look at Reagan's first speech at the first CPAC, where he described the progressive agenda and the dangers it represented, and some of the great debates he had with Carter in the 1980 election. That's about as close as I can get. It does fall on us who were kind of part of that early Reagan army. Of course, it was the very beginning of my career, to carry on what his messaging would be. But let me also say this. When I endorsed Trump on day one, June 16, 2015, I did it because I felt the issues we're confronting in the 21st century had shifted dramatically away from some of the overregulation, tax, anti-communist themes that were predominant in the 20th century. The 21st century issues are, the border first and foremost. If we can't secure the border, the country's gone. All right, period. And any government not willing to secure the border has no interest in preserving the country. Number two, the CCP's aggressive ascent, meaning they see this as an opportune moment. They're great students of history. They see the weakness that exists, and they're cultivating that. By the way, they're cultivating the division within the country. And they're very big on symbolics. That was part of what that whole balloon thing was about. They want to show the world, we'll send a balloon over that whole country.
Well, it's look at TikTok, look at
Hong Kong. You think they're going to come to your defense? Watch what we do in these locations. And sadly, for a lot of the world that might be dealing with a lot of these issues in a very present tense way, they're not going to go back and look at the totality of the American experiences, which is what we always ultimately rise to the occasion. Churchill said, the Americans ultimately always do the right thing after they've tried everything else, right? I mean, we sometimes are very slow to act. And I just gave you one big example with this genocide in China, where we are way slow to act. We were too slow to act in World War II as well with Nazi Germany.
I was going to say, Jessica here has another question, and it's going to lead to, I have a question also. She put, how do you see the ending of the war in Ukraine? Does China come in on Russia's side, the enemy of my enemy scenario, or does the U.S. help Ukraine win, and at what cost, in your opinion?
Xi Jinping and Putin are already allied. They have this limitless agreement that I mentioned. It's not reported because apparently we don't have free media anymore, but the PLA, the military in China, launched cyber attacks against the defense infrastructure of Ukraine. I think that came out of Putin's meeting with Xi Jinping in Beijing during the Olympics. And Xi Jinping dictated the timing of the invasion. He asked that Putin wait until the Winter Olympics were over because he didn't want it to be a distraction to this giant global event that they had put so much focus on, and which was, in their eyes, showcasing their country to the world. Yes. And then, of course, you can look at the United Nations vote. And this, by the way, we should just be citing this all the time. When we had the most symbolic vote in the UN, meaning no real immediate consequences, just it was a condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? Any thoughtful person is going to vote, any thoughtful country would vote to condemn this invasion, just condemn it, right? It wasn't asking for more than that. How did China vote on that question? They abstained. So on this issue of where are they, they are full steam ahead. And in fact, I believe in a lot of ways, Xi Jinping wanted Putin to move on Ukraine first to see what ramifications might exist if he does intend to move on Taiwan. I think they want to take Taiwan. I think they want to take Taiwan peacefully if they can. But if they do need to invade, I think he wanted to see, well, what are the ramifications? And then after that, I can tell you for a fact, once he saw the magnitude of the financial institutions and the magnitude of the sanctions and the way the world economy isolated Putin, he cautioned a lot of his own oligarchs to make other arrangements, with their, financially, and to count on this sort of reaction. So in a way, it was kind of a learning experience for him as to how to defend against the way we would likely respond in the event of them moving on to.
That's what I was going to say. So since they're seeing the reaction and the current administration's weakness, do you think, let's say,
Well, it's also a distraction for us. Let me just be clear that we have no stake. I want to just be clear about this.
Mm.
I condemn Putin's invasion. Right?
Of course.
This is a NATO. This is a European problem. And I'm like, has anything changed on this since I last looked? No. I mean, we got $113 billion going in to a country that is ranked among the top 5 most corrupt in the world. You can remember with Zelensky, after he took power, he came up in the Pandora Papers of having these extraordinary offshore relationship, banking relationship.
Well, I was gonna say my question was gonna be more. I was gonna, I was kind of done with Ukraine. I wanted to bring in, since we were talking about Taiwan and China.
From China's standpoint, if you're looking to weaken the United States, we already have a military that's distracted. We have a military that's involved in all this woke nonsense.
Yes,
it used to be about killing people and breaking things, and presenting such a magnitude of strength that it was a force for peace in the world. Peace through strength, right?
Peace through strength.
Meaning we would deter through our strength. Well, we are not upgrading our military, particularly the nuclear component of our military, and particularly our Navy, our ship, our warship capacity. I don't believe we have taken the evolution into putting the CCP at the centerpiece of defense policy thinking. We still have a Eurocentric view of the world.
And that was, like I said, my question was going to be with this with the whole with our actions between NATO pushing Russia with this to the Ukraine invasion, and now increasing the ties between Russia and China. How likely do you think a Taiwan invasion would be now?
I think Xi Jinping's credibility rests on taking Taiwan peacefully or not, and doing so within the next few years, at the very least. So and let me just also say the threats to Taiwan are not just overt military action, but the fact that you can recall the fifth column from World War II of infiltration within countries.
Well, like what's going on with us too.
Fifth column within Taiwan.
We have a fifth column going on here. I say, and I've said this. I say this on my channel all the time. The whole woke revolution that's going on in the U.S. is just you look at it, and it's the cultural revolution of China. It's Mao's revolution.
But by the way, we're making progress on this. And let me just also say we've got more insight into understanding the CCP, Xi Jinping, the internal dynamics, and what he's doing than he realizes. Okay, so these intel operations work both ways, but the magnitude of their efforts over the last few decades cannot be underestimated, and they would never have been possible if we had had sensible regulations and laws in place. And we ought to right now shut it down on the university level. There should be no. The fact that we had Tony Fauci funding gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology is one of the most absurd realities. And by the way, known to no one. This is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. And it's an example of a man who, just like Biden, despite 50 years of experience within the government, somehow it never got the memo on how communists actually operate, meaning they get to know these people on a personal level, and then they trust them in a collegial, friendly way. They're not trustworthy. Lying is implicit to their whole personality and their training. It's sort of what they're taught to do. It's at the foundation of the ideology of communism. And to have entrusted them on this, as we continue to do, by the way, because there's more Wuhans in China than just Wuhan. That is enormously concerning to me. It's also illegal. And the other thing is just the issue of congressional oversight, which I'm hopeful now with the Congressional House Committee dedicated to the investigation of China, we're going to get to this, but you can't be sure because I think we don't seem to have the dedicated focus of experts that we need doing this work oftentimes. But one of the things has to be is, how is it possible that we have any NIH grant going anywhere in the world or even anywhere in the country that is not subject to the congressional oversight that the Constitution requires? We know that how you're taught in 8th or 9th grade civics that all spending initiates in the House.
Mhm.
Where did the spending initiate in the House for NIH grants to a PLA high-level gain-of-function, let's face it, biological warfare institute? Not doing a whole lot as far as health goes, all right? Biological warfare is a much better description. And that's my concern now with even the present tense, bless you, the present tense definition of what
Thank you.
you say right now, and I'm going to leave, I'm not going to call anybody out on this, but some people on our side over the last few days saying, it was a lab leak. It was, they think they're stretching that. And obviously we've had the Department of Energy that their intel came out and validated that was their operating thesis. But, you're discounting when you state that it was a leak, you're suggesting that somehow it was an innocent oversight and error, not as at least time, place, and motive would indicate. With Trump headed toward re-election, let's face it, in 19, no one would have looked at that. The economy humming on all cylinders and a Democrat opposition that was in complete disarray. No one saw anyone, including Biden, that had any compelling messaging or following. None of them, including Biden, could fill a high school gymnasium, right? That they would release this onto the world and create a sense of disruption. And then look at all the acts that were taken under Trump before Biden came in. Weren't they really ultimately all designed to create the optics of a nation in disarray? Whether they were warranted or unwarranted, and I think many of us concluded they were excessive and unwarranted. The duration of the shutdowns, the masks, which Fauci himself said on 60 Minutes were ineffective, et cetera.
And now we're allowed to say this stuff on YouTube, where in 2020 you couldn't say none of that stuff on YouTube.
But what I'm saying is we got issues here that we're kind of cutting off the debate when we say it was a lab leak. You got two issues that I think that need to be probed very seriously. Number one, that this was a consciously designed biological act of warfare against the United States with political designs of impacting an election that we know itself was fraudulently manipulated. And number two, that the ensuing mRNA vaccine technologies that were presented as vaccines were not vaccines, and they weren't. As we know, that phrase was used, and we put $1 billion of federal funding into media operations to have them drill this message into the minds of the American people, just like totalitarian states do with their media outlets. When now we learn, oh, gee, it was not effective, meaning, obviously, look at the magnitude of cases. I think the majority now of COVID cases were people that had the vaccine. And look at the safe and effective, and it was not safe. We're dealing with thousands upon thousands of deaths and permanent disabilities, and some really troubling revelations, without getting into all of the details of the mRNA technology, but about the lipid nanoparticles and the way they assemble within the body that independent pathologists are identifying in their post-mortem pathological assessments of these patients, things that are unprecedented really in this history of this country, and really show the magnitude of malevolence that exists at some level among individuals with elite and powerful influence in this country, and then frankly, just no oversight on our side. I want to come back to this. Our failure. We should not be using the word. We should be using no singular pronouns, and we should be using no they. It's all us. These things happen on our watch. Our watch. Our watch. It wasn't their successes. We allowed them to happen. We allowed the politicization of public health. And the unaccountability and the individuals that were off on all of these designs. We allowed the FDA to be corrupted with big pharma money. I worked in big pharma at a time when I was trying to get the FDA to speed up some logical, just speed the process up. But to have gone that extra step and actually now have, I think, close to 50% of total funding of the FDA coming from the very companies that they ostensibly are charged with regulating, it's got to be the ultimate absurdity. And did we miss the debate on this? Where was the House? Where were the floor debates?
Well, not just big pharma, but you look at the revolving door between, regulators and the companies that they're supposed to regulate. Like they'll leave Pfizer, go work for the FDA.
That's always existed. Go back
to Pfizer.
Incompetent people are going to be able to function at high levels in private sector and public sector. That's understandable too. It's not even that we want to preclude that, but the idea that we would have a policy change that would allow the compromise of a regulatory body as critical as the Food and Drug Administration by the very entities that are charged with being overseen by it is absurd, because there's not, at least let's just take in the case of mRNA, what's the backup plan? It's the voluntary reporting VAERS system, which itself also needs to be changed. Now that the House, and we put a lot of work, and I put a lot of work into getting the House, we need to have as methodical reporting on vaccine-related deaths and disabilities as we do
my son was my son got injured with the MMR vaccine, and you can't, there's not much reporting that you could really do about it, because since my son has other disabilities, they were like, oh, how do we know? And my pediatrician, when we told him what was going on, my pediatrician said, oh no, not again.
I'm surprised that they said. I will tell you that for a long time, I heard about correlations between the most commonly administered vaccines that I willingly got, like the MMR vaccine, which every kid has a requirement for entry into schools, and autism and other correlations. And I kind of viewed it skeptically, but the lesson we take away from that is when you see enough of these incidents and parents that feel so passionately concluded that this actually did happen, you have to take it. Our oversight and accountability of this government is ultimately falls on we the people.
No,
even when I was in government, I told people that.
Well, even on the individual, so my son was vaccine injured. So I'm not against vaccines. What I did was I spaced out my daughter's shots. When I had my next child, I just, I told them, okay, you're not giving her MMR and DTaP on the same day. I'll come back another time. Yeah. But I'm not going to give them to her all at the same time.
Well, and it's not, good for you for trying to be innovative about that. But the point is, the guidance that we should be getting from these very well-funded agencies should be based on science. And one thing about science that I guess Fauci disagrees with, science is never settled.
Exactly.
Whenever you hear someone say the science on that is settled, they don't understand science.
Yeah.
Science is a process of continuing to assess, evaluate, test, retest, test against placebo, etc. What does and does not work, and then all of the associated variables. That's one of the concerning aspects of what Naomi Wolf, to her great credit, brought out with these Pfizer documents, is the fact that there were tangible steps that they presented to Pfizer that were part of the FDA phase trials that the documents seem to suggest were not actually taken. And just by coincidence, now why would Pfizer not want those documents released? Why did they go to court to seek the 75-year protection?
Of course.
It's kind of like the Kennedy assassination documents,
Yeah.
that we'll release them, but when all of you guys are dead.
Yes, exactly.
We wanted this to be a historical reflection, so that even if it was immensely criticized, it was like, well, this was really horrible, but it was those guys back there. Now, all of this is, and what's tragic about it is because I guess this massive funding that went into media that was designed to promote these vaccines, you had these corporate entities that just developed policies that betrayed the foundations of journalistic integrity, which is that these things should be investigated and reported. The allegations should be assessed with the utmost seriousness. They should never be summarily dismissed. And no one in any moment, in any way, within the debate of science should be shut down because their thesis happens to run contrary the interests of wealth and power in the country or in the world. We used to kind of like stipulate that all those things were factually true. Sadly, you now have to almost remind the American people that all of this has occurred, and it's occurred, let me be blunt, because we've allowed it to occur. Okay. When people say, why is this happening? That's the easiest response. I mean, I could go on for hours and hours. Why is it happening? Because you are allowing it to happen. They are organized, they're collaborative, they're unified, they are immensely strategic. We're none of those things. We got a bunch of authors, TV hosts, and university lecturers, and that's it, basically.
I was gonna say,
and they won't fight the battles.
I was gonna say one last question before you go, because two of the viewers have pretty much similar questions, because it seems like what your whole what you were talking about with the managed decline. It looks like here that there are two similar questions. They go, what would be your message to normal working class family to keep afloat in this downward economy? And Jessica asked something similar. She goes, if you were advising a nominee running for president, what would the message be to give? What message to give to the American people in these tough times? So I go this similar.
Well, I would, and I'll have to preface this with the usual disclaimer to consult your financial planners and other experts, attorneys, etc. But let me just say, I am not optimistic about the immediate future of the American economy. I don't see the underlying fundamentals being promising. I don't see the geopolitical scenario in the world being very promising either. And politically, we have the ability, I think, in quick order to develop consensus for change, but we have operational impediments as it relates to the system itself. And I'm not just talking about elections, but how Congress functions. We need structural change that allows a lot more empowerment of individual members of Congress, less power in the hands of the leadership. So what can they do? Get politically involved. I routinely share guidance with my followers on Twitter and Facebook. Follow me. If you have Tea Party organizations or MAGA organizations, get involved and operate conservatively on an assumption that the downturn in this economy, including the inflationary pressures that most every American is confronting in food, gasoline, electric prices, will continue even worsen. And then maybe I'm wrong about those things, and that would be great. And you'll be better off for having prepared for it. But don't jump to an optimistic conclusion right now, because I don't think the underlying fundamentals in any way suggest. I can't even believe that financial reporting is questioning the doubt that we're in a recession. I mean, definitely recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. We've had it. So we're like rewriting the rules and fundamental definitions of things we long understood to be true for an extraordinary period of time. And that's dangerous as well. And it's also part of a kind of, let's be honest, a revolutionary climate where anyone who's been through one of these things realizes they will attempt to get you to question everything that you ever believed in true. Continue to believe in America, continue to believe in whatever faith you are in faith, because there is power in faith. Yep. And I've heard enough examples of that to know it to be true. And then don't think that you can do these things alone, and don't fall into isolation. Join with others, and don't buy into what is called conspiracy theories. And so I've discussed some things tonight, and I brought some facts to them as it relates to some questions that, hopefully the worst case scenarios that I've presented are not the case. And that's fine. That would be to my satisfaction if it were the case. But don't conclude necessarily, as some would have you do, when you're in a period of uncertainty. Some of these extreme, unproven theories are actually distractions from what's right in front of you, and are actually consciously designed to be influenced. So we're in a period where you need to choose your sources of information very carefully. And I'll tell you one thing. I mean, I'm not alone in this, but I am very serious. Obviously, you can tell I believe in America. I believe in freedom, but I'm also believe in facts. I never would consciously misrepresent anyone on anything. I never have. And I've made bold predictions in this, in this, including the fact that the former Soviet Union would collapse imminently, including the fact that the Tea Party movement would take back the country, which it did, including the fact that Donald Trump in 2015, I said, would be the 45th president of the United States. When I say things like that, I do it because I brought every ounce of professional and instinctual bit of information that I can together, and I never do it if I don't have those things in line. So when I say something, to my knowledge, I don't think I've gotten anything factually inaccurate in 30 plus years of doing this, and I'm serious about that. I don't want that ever to be the case. Maybe it does prove to be the case one day. I hope it will not be the case, and I put every effort into taking this, I think, more seriously, frankly, than some on our side do. But I don't want to understate the magnitude of threat that this country confronts. Never has there been a more dangerous moment.
And I think that's a good place to end right there. I think it is very dangerous. I think for people you watching here on YouTube and Rumble, you can see I'll put it in the description. It's Twitter, Michael Johns. You could he also has his link tree there, so that'll put you to all his contact information where you can follow him on Facebook and Twitter. And if you're someone who watching for the first time, please give my channel a like and subscribe. I'm gonna have some Michael's one of many interesting guests that I bring on. Next week I'm gonna have a guest on, a filmmaker who's making a film on the whole the issue of young women who are transitioning to men, and the whole issue of I've seen a snippet of his movie, and he's bringing the facts. It's not going to be emotional, it's fact based. He's talking about the medical studies around the world, not just biased studies that are going on in our own country. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation, as tonight's conversation was very interesting. Michael, you want to say anything else before you go? Any other than Facebook, Twitter? Is there any place else where people could follow you?
There are, but those are 2 good starting points. And it's great to be back with you. Thanks for all you're doing. Thanks for your community of viewers, which I know is great and growing. You're doing great work. And we need to all unify around this cause and our country, and
especially our country.
Principles. We were warned about this by our founders, And it's a good time to refresh yourself on many of what the warnings they offered us actually were, because they anticipated a lot of the things that are actually transpiring on our watch right now.
Oh, with that being said, well, have a good night, everyone, and hope everyone enjoyed the show.